Hello again, Guy. Thanks for coming back to join us for this part two of this episode. I'm really looking forward to this next conversation about the work that you do. If folks missed our first part of the conversation, you'll want to go back and listen to that. I'll give you a lot of context in terms of where we're going next. So we left off with the mission and vision of the Alliance. And you talked about the three main buckets that you do around this work. I would love to get into more of the specifics because I know there's a lot of parents listening who have experienced this in the past, or maybe they're going through this experience and they really want to know, what can I do in terms of advocacy, talking to the teachers, creating change, that shift that you were talking about.
Right.
And then the second piece of that is helping teachers and administrators understand the alternatives to seclusion and restraint. Because I've never met a teacher where this hasn't happened, that they have not been distressed by it as well, right? Like it doesn't feel good. They do not want to be resorting
Absolutely.
to this, and they
Absolutely.
don't know what else to do. So whichever one of those you want to begin with.
All right. Sounds good. Now you put the pressure on me to figure out which direction to start on. So let me start by giving you. So we talked last time about kind of what the mission is of the Alliance, and as I said, it's really more about punitive exclusionary discipline, outdated behavior management, trying to move people in better directions, and we do a lot of things to support that kind of approach. What I want to share with you to kind of get started in this conversation is, as I began doing this work, people would ask me, and I remember the very first time I was asked this, but they would say, well, you don't want us to restrain or seclude. What do we do instead?
Yes.
And you can take that question and you can apply it to a lot of things. What do you want us to do instead of suspension or expulsion? What do you want us to do instead of corporal punishment? I mean, so that question commonly comes up. And as you highlighted a moment ago, no teacher or educator wants to restrain or seclude a kid. In fact, it's a traumatic experience for the staff.
Yes.
Ironically, though, what we find is that the trauma that it causes a child can lead the child to be more likely to have behavior in the future. And the trauma it causes to the adult can cause the adult to be more likely to fall back on something like restraint seclusion again in the future.
That's right.
So these things do not work in terms of helping to prevent them from happening again in the future. But to that question of, well, what do we do instead? That's a really big question. And when I first started this work, the first time somebody asked me that question, I don't know that I really had a good answer. I was in the process of really trying to find what were the alternatives, what could we do instead of doing these things, and I was connecting with people from all over the world. Quite frankly, I was reaching out to people like Bonadella Hook and Lori Desautel and others, and trying to connect. And what I found is actually people would have conversations with me. And I began to learn a lot by connecting with people.
Yeah.
But, again, the first time somebody asked me that question, I don't think I had a good answer. And over these years since starting the Alliance, we've developed what I call kind of our core principles. And the core principles in my mind are the answer to that question of what do we do instead.
Okay.
So I want to share with you a little bit about what those core principles are. Now, I've come to call them the five principles. Who knows? And one day there might be 7 principles, or 4, or whatever the case may be.
We'll be flexible then.
That's right. That's right. So that should be a principle. We're now at 6, but these 5 principles were really an attempt to figure out, well, what do we do instead? How do we better support teachers, students, and staff? And what we talk about now with the 5 principles, I'll go over them quickly and then I'll kind of take a dive in.
Okay.
We talk about, the real shift here is moving in a direction that supports trauma-informed, neuroscience-aligned, neurodiversity affirming, relationship-driven, and collaborative approaches.
Yes.
Now, that's a lot. To break it down, really what I'm talking about here, let's begin with trauma-informed. There's a lot of information that we have over the last several decades about the impact of trauma. The 1990s were the decade of the brain. We've learned more about the human brain and nervous system since the 90s than we had in all of the time that existed before then. And with that knowledge, we began to learn a lot about the impacts of trauma. And in fact, we can go back over 20 some years ago. There was a study called the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, large study done by Kaiser. They looked at kind of what was the impact long term of potentially traumatic childhood experiences. And they looked at a set of different types of experiences, not a all-encompassing set, but they looked at things like, if you were in a household where, with violence or drug use or, domestic, violence or other things like that, what
Right.
was the impact that these things could have on a child in the long term? And what they found were a number of things. I mean, children who were coming from houses that had, a lot of these experiences, they might be more likely to develop trauma. They might be more likely to, as adults, have long-term health issues, chronic health conditions. They might be more likely to get involved with drugs and alcohol use. They might be more likely to have difficult times forming relationships. And of course, when it comes to education, relationships are kind of a cornerstone of that. But we've known for some time that the impacts of trauma can be significant. We know the prevalence of trauma is much more common than people think. Initially, when people started, looking at trauma, they looked at people that were coming back from wars and really,
Right.
things that everybody would say, well, those are very traumatic events, but not recognizing kind of the everyday trauma that happens to so many. So, this work begins with taking trauma-informed approaches. When we begin to understand the prevalence of trauma, we assume trauma might be in someone's background and do things to make sure we're not re-traumatizing individuals.
Yes.
It makes a big difference. So that idea, that trauma-informed idea has become more prevalent, and we see it more around education these days than we saw it before.
Mhm.
But what I'll say to it is that it's not a one and done thing. It really is about a journey.
Yes. Well, the integration of what you're learning, the embodiment of it as well, so
That's
that it
right. That's
actually
right. That's right.
translates to your practice.
Right.
Yeah.
And it's not just a matter of understanding that the kids have experienced trauma. It often is kind of reflective as well, understanding our own, trauma that we may have endured.
Hmm.
This work heavily begins with the adult. And, when we begin to understand our own trauma, our own triggers, our own difficulty, that can be
Hmm.
really helpful.
Oh, my
But if you,
listeners hear about that all the time from me.
yeah, yeah. Well, and again, trauma informed is not something you're doing just to support kids. Like one of the things I think is really critical about being a trauma informed system, whether it be a school or a medical setting, whatever it may be,
Yes.
is that you're not just trauma informed towards the children you support. You need to take a trauma informed approach to every human being that comes into contact with your system.
Yes.
So if you're an administrator, you're taking a trauma informed approach with your staff.
That's
You
right.
take a trauma informed
That's
approach with
right.
your family. You don't blame or shame parents. You understand that these parents that a child that's coming from a difficult setting might have parents that have had experienced a tremendous amount of trauma as well. It's understanding it's much more deeper than what people often think about. So that
Yeah.
trauma piece is a big piece. The neuroscience piece is one of the things that I think is I want to say life changing, because when you begin to understand human behavior through that lens of the brain and our nervous system, you understand behavior much differently.
Yeah.
For a long time, our look at behavior has been pretty shallow. We look at behavior, even when we do it in a structured way. We can take it what's pretty commonplace in our schools, where we have functional behavioral assessments, and we look at what's the function of the behavior, and we
Yeah.
give it one of four functions. We say, well, they were escaping, they were attention seeking, they were avoiding, whatever the case may be. That is a really oversimplistic look at human behavior. Human behavior is influenced by our genetics. It's influenced by our brain, our nervous system. It's influenced by our lived experiences. It's influenced by even generational trauma.
That's
There's
right.
a lot that goes into behavior that's far deeper than a matter of intent. But
Yeah.
very often people look at human behavior through that lens. They think that, people are making bad choices, right? And when you look at behavior as being intentional, the tools in your toolbox become ways to motivate people to have the intent you want them to have. So
Mhm.
if you think they're behaving a certain way because this is what they're intending to do, well, maybe if we offer a reward or a consequence, we can shape the behavior differently. We know now more about human behavior. We know now that our behavior is influenced by brain development, by our genetics, by so many different things. And when you begin to look at behavior through the lens of the brain and nervous system, you understand that, guess what? Not all behavior is in fact intentional.
That's right.
We have a tendency to think about all behavior as being intentional. We
That's
have a tendency to look at behavior and think, well, gee, if only they had a consequence or a reward, we could get them to do what we want them to do. There's much more beneath behavior. And in fact, when we are born, all of our behavior is about survival, right? We don't have a developed prefrontal cortex that is responsible for, kind of decision making and logic and, executive function. that prefrontal cortex develops from the time that we're born over many, many years, well into adulthood. Yet we often have expectations of kids that are not developmentally appropriate. We often think about them having ability to self-regulate,
Yes.
ability to make decisions they don't have. So when you begin to understand human behavior through that lens of the brain and nervous system, it changes everything because you
Yeah.
begin to realize some behaviors are kind of bottom up. They're stress responses. They're not intentional behaviors to get out of something or to get access to something. So that part about neuroscience aligned to me is really critical in this work.
Yes.
When you see behavior differently, you respond to behavior differently, and that's where real change happens.
Yeah. And
Um,
let me just note
sure.
real quickly, because this, I mean, this will make sense to the parents who listen to this podcast consistently, because that's all we talk about
Yep.
on this podcast. But the piece that you talked about when you're talking about systems changing, whether that's a residential treatment system, a school system, whatever it might be, child serving systems is what we're talking about. And having the culture of that system be aligned with neuroscience. Like that's the
Right.
other piece here that I just want to
Okay.
point out to folks. If you are doing it in isolation as one teacher, one social worker, one parent in this system that's very
Yep.
entrenched in a behavioral lens, yeah, it's going to feel hard because it
Yep. Yep.
is really, really hard. So,
Absolutely. And
okay.
not to say you can't make a difference. You can make a difference. You can make a difference for kids, but it is really hard. A lot of these changes that that we're talking about here
Yeah,
are ones that we need at systemic levels.
yeah, yeah. Okay, so pillar three.
So three is about neurodiversity affirming, and
Yes.
for way too long, I think that a lot of the supports around supporting individuals that are neurodivergent have been aligned with kind of a medical model of disability, right? They look through a lens of deficit and disorder and dysfunction. What do we need to do to take someone who is, neurodivergent and make them appear to be more neurotypical? That's the wrong goal. That
Yeah.
should never be our goal. But very commonly it has been. Over time, of course, the social model of disability began to really emerge. People began to understand this idea of, this should be not about, how do we take someone who is different and make them appear to be more typical, but how do we support people? How do we remove barriers?
That's right.
How do we appreciate and embrace individual differences? In fact, our individual differences are often a strength in so many ways. So, this idea of being neurodiversity affirming is not only understanding neurodiversity, understanding that, no, there's not one typical brain. All of our brains are, in fact, neurodiverse,
Yes.
but some of us are neurodivergent. So, we may have brains that really differ from the typical brain. These are, often we think about autism or ADHD, but there's a whole wide umbrella here. We might be
That's
talking
right.
about fetal alcohol syndrome. We might be talking about so many different things that might make up kind of what we would call a neurodivergent mind.
Yeah.
And for far too long, I think the ideas have been, you can look at them in so many different areas. Social skills is a good example where the focus has been how do we take somebody who is neurodivergent and make them, appear to be more neurotypical? That's absolutely the wrong goal. So we are big believers in approaches that are neurodiversity affirming that are about supporting all brains and all individuals. And our goal should not be things that, I'll give you a real life example here. My son for many years had a goal in his IEP that one day I questioned when suddenly it hit me. But he had a goal about making eye contact.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's such a common one.
If you're autistic, making eye contact not only is not something that you might find comfortable, but you might actually find it physically uncomfortable, physically
Yes.
painful.
Yes.
Why on earth would, and of course, my son did not need to look at anybody to hear the 10 conversations happening around him.
Yes.
But again, I think it's a matter of shifting perspective and mindset, and we're big proponents of doing things that are moving in a more neurodiversity affirming direction.
Yeah.
Even
Let
in
me just
educational practices, thinking about how we can incorporate things like universal design for learning or other things to support different kinds of brains and different kinds of learners.
Yeah, and I just want to be really clear about where the responsibility is and everything that you're talking about.
Sure.
I mean, talking about accommodations for these differences, and the person who holds the power and authority in that environment is the one who's responsible for shifting that environment. oftentimes you talk about IEPs, but there's other situations where it's the child will do this. This is what they will change.
Right.
This is how they will conform. Right.
Yep.
So just want folks to be clear on that piece too.
Absolutely. And I mean, you see those kind of things in behavior plans frequently as well, right? We put all of the onus on the child who, has the least developed brain,
Yes.
has we don't look at what are the things that the adult needs to change or do differently to better support the child. And those things are really critical as well.
Yeah.
So that brings me to the fourth one, which is getting into a collaborative. Collaborative is about, rather than doing things to people or doing things for people, how do we do things with people? How do we shift ourselves away from kind of power over models to power with,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
This is really critical in this work. And when you begin to collaborate with children, rather than, kind of imposing things on them,
Mhm.
you can develop solutions that actually are true solutions. Very often, when you leave it to, an adult and you don't involve the child, you can look at a behavior plan as a good example. So, child's having a difficult time. We do a functional behavioral assessment. We give it a function here. We decide they're attention seeking, and then we come up with a hypothesis about how we can change the behavior. We come up with this really great reward program, and we're going to give the child rewards for meeting these expectations,
Mhm.
and that's that, right? The child wasn't necessarily even involved in that process, nor does that process really account for the fact that the reward, while well intentioned, is probably not going to really help shift their behavior in the long run. There's a lot beneath the surface of why a child may not meet an expectation. That's where we should be focused, not on the fact that they
That's right.
didn't meet it and trying to offer them a reward or a consequence for meeting it. But very often, that tends to be the approach. We don't involve the child. When you involve a child in trying to understand why they're having difficulty, when what you're doing is led by curiosity, that's what takes you to the place you
Yes.
really need to be. When you get to the deeper why of why a child's having a difficult time, maybe it's a skill that hasn't been developed. Maybe it's a capacity that you're expecting them to have that's not even developmentally appropriate.
That's right.
Maybe there's a stressor that you don't see. Maybe there's something sensory that's happening. We really need to be pushing in the direction of curiosity and understanding why kids are having a hard time rather than just kind of coming up with this plan. So collaboration is really key. And think about it as an adult. I mean, I always say, like, the things that we do to kids, we would never do to an adult. If you and I were working in the same place, and let's say you were working in a department that I was overseeing, I would probably not put a clip chart outside of my department, with and say, well, you need to clip down. You're not having a very good day now, are you? You haven't met my expectation. We do things to kids all the time. We should be more focused on doing things with them, getting them involved. And when you do, you create solutions that I think are really far more durable and get to the root of what some of the difficulty might been.
Yes.
So
Yeah.
collaboration to me is key.
Yeah. Let me just note something else about that. For some of the parents who are listening who maybe have kids that have very limited language or ability to participate in that conversation, my daughter, who's 17, there were many, many years where we would invite her into that conversation, but she really wasn't able to identify for us what the problem was or any solutions. And we still continued to do it because as her skills built, she was able to participate more fully.
Right.
But the thing that does, even if your child doesn't have the skills to give you like brainstorm ideas and feedback
Sure,
and
sure.
connect like their feelings to what's happening, all of that kind of stuff, it builds relationship. And
Absolutely.
they know that
Absolutely.
they are a part of it and that you're there working alongside them rather than that power over model that you
That's right.
talked about. So I just
That's
want to
right.
highlight that for
That's right.
anyone who's listening saying, well, my child can't do that. Like they
That's
can't
right.
participate. There's
That's
still
right.
a
Oh,
benefit to
and there
following
are
them.
models out there. I think you and I might have talked about this in the past, but there are models out there like collaborative proactive solutions or collaborative problem solving
Hmm.
that actually provide models and ways that you can do this.
Yeah.
And I've seen those models applied to non-speaking children. I've seen, those models applied in ways that, can be helpful in cases for children that may have, different needs or different abilities. But I couldn't agree with you more. And your point there takes us into the last part of this, which is relationship driven, right?
Yeah.
This is all
Yeah.
about relationships.
Yes.
How many parents out there can relate to having a child in let's just use school as an example, but in a classroom where they're really having a difficult time and things aren't going well and we're seeing behaviors and it's been a tough year, tough quarter, whatever it's been. At some point, they move into a different environment, different teachers working with them. Suddenly, everything's different. What hasn't changed from between scenario one and scenario two is the child. The child's still the same, but very often, the adult that is working with the child, when they build a relationship, when they build trust, when they show that the child is important, everything can change. And people that are approaching your kid with a compliance-based mindset and very focused on, kind of control and compliance,
Yeah.
may not be doing well, but suddenly a different adult is doing much better.
Yes.
Relationships are the heart of all this work. I mean, Bruce Perry, who's a foremost expert on trauma, and I've always recommend his book, What Happened to You, if you've not read that. But
with Oprah.
yeah, it was a great book, great audio book as well.
It's
one of my
awesome.
favorites formats. But it kind of talks about this idea that relationships are what help us to heal from trauma. Trauma, we know from kind of back to the neuroscience and the trauma informed pieces here, we know that trauma has an impact on the brain, somewhat negative impact of the brain. We can look at studies. There have been fMRI studies looking at kind of regions of the brain and what happens when people experience a lot of trauma. You find that areas like our hippocampus, which is involved in kind of memory and learning in our limbic system, that can become a decrease in volume. Our amygdala, when you're very young, can increase in volume. That's our threat detection system. There are actual brain changes in structure and function that happen due to trauma. And that's a pretty sad story. The flip side of that is that through connection, through relationship, we have kind of what my friend Lori Desautel calls a human superpower, and that's neuroplasticity.
Yeah.
We used to kind of think the brain would kind of develop and then kind of be done developing at a certain point. But the truth is that you can always create new neural pathways. You can always learn new things. And what we find is that relationships create kind of a fertile substrate for neuroplasticity. When you feel safe and seen and connected, you're able to have new connections form in your brain. It's almost the opposite of the impact of trauma in terms of trauma causing a lot of negative changes in the brain. Relationships can be a really great catalyst for positive changes in the brain.
Yes.
So relationships are really critical to this work and often make all the difference in the world between a child who is struggling and a child who is successful. And this point I think is really important. When I talk about relationship, I'm not talking about therapeutic rapport. I'm talking about a authentic relationship.
Yes.
I'm talking about a give and take relationship.
Yeah.
I'm talking about a relationship where you're honest and open, because a lot of our kids, especially a lot of our neurodivergent kids, they will see right through the attempt to kind of create a fake relationship, so to speak.
Yes.
So at any rate, those are kind of our principles of what we believe we should be doing to better support kids. It's trauma-informed, neuroscience aligned, neurodiversity affirming, relationship driven, and collaborative.
Awesome. I love it. So I want to have the listeners be able to walk away with either at least pointing them in the direction where they can take next steps. So we could have a whole third episode on what parents can do, what teachers can do. But maybe a helpful starting point, at least for this conversation, is if there is a parent whose child is currently experiencing seclusion and restraint in their school or their community in some way, and they are really concerned about it, what would you suggest is the first step they take to get support, to get guidance, and then let's talk about the same maybe for teachers and administrators where they can take those first steps too.
Yeah. So if you're a parent and you're in a situation where you're concerned about restraint or seclusion or other punitive and exclusionary kind of discipline, the first thing you may do is have a conversation with your school, have a conversation with your teacher. We always recommend that people, abide by the same principles that we recommend for supporting children, right? So we always want to begin with collaboration. Can we work with the school? Can we work with the district? Can we express our concerns and offer to them a better way of supporting our children? Of course, we welcome parents to reach out to us as well if they're in a situation. What we find is that not all schools are created equally. There are schools that you can reach out, you can collaborate, and who are happy to have your input and work with you. There are others that kind of give you we know best, we're the experts, let us handle it. And when your instincts tell you what they're doing is not working, you need to follow those instincts. So at any rate, I think a starting place for a parent that might find themselves in this situation, um, reach out to us, share your concerns, begin to look for what are the better things we can do to better support, our child. But, if you have concerns, take those seriously. The harm that can be caused by, not only restraint and seclusion, but not getting the appropriate supports that your child needs can have a lifelong impact. So I would
Yes.
just say, you have to take these things very seriously.
Okay.
And of course, there are things that you can recommend. I mean, there are options. There are better practices and approaches that can be recommended to the school as well.
Okay. And that leads maybe to our second piece of for teachers and administrators. I don't know if you have some go-to practices for them or a place where they can find resources that are specific to alternatives to seclusion and
Sure,
restraint, but
sure.
any kind of first steps or direction to give them.
Yeah, so we actually have a page, and I'll share that with you about alternatives.
Great.
What are the things that we might want to do instead? What are some of the approaches? And they cover a wide range of territory. So, there's approaches there like, collaborative problem solving that really is about how do we go upstream? How do we realize that a lot of the difficulties that a child may have are predictable?
Yeah.
And how do we, kind of go upstream and really try to work with the child before we get to a point that the child is escalated? There are approaches like Dr. Bruce Perry developed what's called the neurosequential model for education. We've seen classrooms that have implemented his model in helping them to move away from a lot of restrictive practices. A lot of this work, in my mind, is really upstream. It's about how do we go upstream and prevent getting to the situation that we've gotten to in the first place. We actually worked with and collaborated with, kind of may sound like a strange partner, but we collaborated with Crisis Prevention Institute, which is a company that provides training on de-escalation and restraint. And you may wonder why on earth the Alliance Against Seclusion and Restraint would be collaborating with CPI. Well, we actually found out that we shared some common thoughts and ideas and goals. One of them was about going upstream, and we actually co-developed a program with them called Reframing Behavior. Reframing Behavior is a whole school program designed to really bring the education, the kind of the neuroscience piece of understanding behavior to teachers, to educators, to paraprofessionals. Because when you understand behavior differently, you realize why the things you're doing are not working,
Yes.
and you then
Yes.
can figure out what to do instead. So there are a number of different programs out there. For those that might be in the field that want to kind of further their own knowledge, I have a colleague, Dr. Lori Desautel, who runs a program in applied educational neuroscience, a fantastic program that really focuses on understanding that brain and body connection, understanding the science behind our behavior, teaching that to children, like teaching children actually to understand their own stress response system, their own behavior, and that can
Yes.
be really powerful. So there's a lot of things you can do. We do book studies. We do book studies for anyone that's interested. We also do some just for educators, and
Yeah.
the educator ones are really fantastic because it's kind of a safe place where you're learning with other educators who are out there trying to do better. So there's a lot of resources out there. I'll provide you with that link as well.
Great.
But the key is start the journey, right? If you're not on the journey, be
Yes.
curious and think about, what can we do differently? How can we better support, the kids that we're supporting? And at the end of the day, I think the outcome is going on this journey. You can not only improve the outcomes for the kids, but you can improve the outcomes for the teachers, for the staff, for the families, for the communities. So there's so much to be
Yes.
gained by kind of being curious and going on this journey.
Yes. Oh my gosh. This will not be our last conversation, I'm pretty sure.
Part three.
If you agree to
Training.
come back.
Sure.
You
No, I
have
appreciate the conversation.
oh, I do too. It's so it just is so affirming when we are able to connect with people who think about behaviors and these kids and these families and these systems in the same way. And I know that the parents listening will just breathe a sigh of relief hearing your story and hearing about the resources you provide. I want to thank you for taking that leap from your quote unquote real job and and making the jump over here into this like huge, big undertaking that, of course, is so meaningful, impactful, and that the educators too, and the administrators who listen, or the social workers who work in residential treatment, I mean,
Right,
whatever
right,
system they
right.
are, I think that most people feel like this isn't right. We shouldn't be doing this, but what else can I do? Like, I don't
And
know.
broken
So,
systems perpetuate bad practice. So,
yeah,
I look at this and I don't think like, I mean, there's nothing wrong with your kids, right? Your kids are not broken.
that's
They're
right.
not getting what they need. They're
That's
not
right.
getting, when I find a kid that's being restrained and secluded, they're being restrained and secluded because we failed to meet their individual needs. We have not
Yes,
supported them appropriately.
that's
Had
right.
we would not have gotten to the point where they became escalated, where the restraint or seclusion was used. But, the same holds true when we look at our teachers and staff that a brand new teacher probably never even learned about restraint seclusion, and when they come into the classroom for the first time, if it's a practice being used in the school where they are, they
Yeah,
might be like, well, this doesn't really feel right. I don't know how I feel about this, but they're told by somebody in authority that this is what we do when these children are having a difficult time,
yeah,
and it
yeah.
becomes normalized. It becomes
Yes,
something that they do. I
yes,
mean, if you stand back and think about like the idea of locking a kid in a room and not letting them out, like that should really be something that does not seem like something we should do,
yeah,
but they become normalized. And I think it's not the people get into teaching jobs because they want to help. They're really helper professions. People become educators because they want to help kids. But when a system is not appropriately supported, and it may be a matter of resources, it may be a matter of a lot of things. Bad practice can then become more prevalent and
that's right.
justified, and suddenly there's a switch that flips, and then even the educators who were well intentioned begin to look at the kids differently.
That's right.
They see them as violent, and that unhealthy system can result in a lot of harm.
Yes, yes, absolutely. Well, you listed a ton of wonderful resources. I will make sure to get those all cataloged in the show notes for folks, for educators, professionals, and also parents. Guy, thank you so much. I appreciate
Absolutely.
your time and taking the time to share all of this with me. It's been wonderful having you.
Absolutely. I appreciate the opportunity, and appreciate the opportunity to meet your audience, and again encourage them, if there's anything we can do to support them, reach out, and happy to have a conversation.
Right. Awesome. Take care.